science of the mind-body connection. This might be the most interesting open question remaining in science because it sits right at the heart of where science meets spirituality. There have been many attempts to answer this question both from a philosophical and a scientific perspective, and whilst we may still not know the exact answer to this question, it is so interesting to consider because it has such far-reaching implications about the nature of our reality. Hey everyone, I'm Georgia. I'm currently studying a master's degree in consciousness, spirituality and transpersonal psychology, and in today's video I'm going to be delving into a question which goes right to the heart of all those topics, and this is the question of the mind-body connection. How are the mind and body linked, or more specifically, how is consciousness linked to the brain? Now, there are so many examples of how the mind and body interact with each other, and I'm just going to go into a few of them before we consider some potential explanations of this connection. Now, the first example of how the mind and body interact is through mental states which correlate to physiological states. Now, there are many examples of this, but one obvious example is through the stress response. I'm sure we're all very familiar with the mental aspect of stress, the worrying and the negative thought spirals that go with it. But there is also the physiological aspect of stress. For example, our heart might start racing or we get sweaty palms. So we know that when it comes to certain responses such as the stress response, there is both a mental aspect and a physiological aspect that correlate to each other. Now, another example of the mind-body connection is how thoughts lead to feelings. When we have a thought, a biochemical reaction goes on in our brains, and this reaction leads to chemical signals being sent down into our body, and these signals result in emotions which correspond to the thought that we had in the first place. And this whole process actually creates a feedback loop whereby the feelings that we are now experiencing actually cause more thoughts like the ones that caused it in the first place. So we get this loop where the thoughts cause emotions and the emotions cause more of the thoughts, and we basically condition our body into this response and we condition ourselves into a certain emotion. Now, a third example of the mind-body connection is the placebo effect. Now, the placebo effect is where someone is given an inert substance such as a sugar pill, but because they expect healing, like for example in a clinical trial where they believe they are getting the treatment, they still experience a therapeutic benefit because they expected healing. That positive expectation actually facilitated a healing response within the body, despite the patient not being given any active medication or treatment. So the mind can actually activate biochemical pathways within the body, just like medication can. And this can actually go both ways. There is also the nocebo effect, and this is where negative expectations cause negative responses within our body. Now, final example of the mind-body problem is epigenetics. And this is basically all about the fact that the environment surrounding our cells can actually affect gene expression. And this doesn't just mean the environment around our cells in the sense of the physical health of our body, for example, through the food we eat, but it also is affected by our thoughts and our emotions. And Dr. Joe Dispenza has done a lot of really fascinating work using this principle, essentially teaching people to change their state of being to change their gene expression in a positive way. So all of these examples make it very clear that the mind and body are linked. Now, it is also very clear that the mind is linked to the body specifically through the brain. Now, we know this just through common sense, but also we know this through neural correlates of consciousness, essentially processes in the brain which correspond to different aspects of conscious experience. So for example, we know that different stages of wakefulness and sleep correspond to different brain waves. But the mystery is, how are these different states of mind or consciousness linked to these different brain states? We know that they're correlated, but we don't know why. Now, there are many different theories of how mind and matter are linked, and I just want to look at a few of the main philosophical theories before I then go a bit deeper into the science. So one theory is dualism. Now, dualism is the idea that mind and matter are two completely separate things. Now, in this sense, Descartes was a dualist because he believed that mind and matter were two wholly different substances. He believed that the whole world and animals and human bodies were all mechanical, but he believed that human minds, like the mind of God, were spiritual and were separate to the material realm, and he believed that the way they interacted was through the pineal gland. So another overarching theory of how mind and matter are linked is materialism, and this is the prevailing paradigm within Western science. Now, materialism is essentially the idea that the brain produces consciousness. Now, many people like to argue that there is no mystery here and that it is known that the brain produces consciousness, but let me tell you, Even amongst those who do believe in a materialist worldview, there is no agreement as to how the brain produces consciousness. There are so many different theories, which tells you that nobody knows. And if nobody knows how the brain produces consciousness, it can't be claimed that it definitely does. So whilst materialism is a valid theory, it is still just that. It is a theory. It is not proven. Another theory, which is the complete opposite to materialism, is idealism. And this is the idea that consciousness is what is primary. So physical matter in this theory is thought to be secondary to consciousness in some way. Somehow it derives from consciousness. An example of this is Kastrup's theory of cosmic consciousness. He believes cosmic consciousness is what is fundamental, and that the physical world is an outer reflection of cosmic consciousness. And he argues that our individual consciousness is essentially an alter of cosmic consciousness that has dissociated in a similar way to people who have dissociative identity disorder, and our physical bodies are the outer reflection of our individual consciousness. But the key principle of idealism is essentially that it is consciousness which is primary. And finally, another main theory of how mind and matter are linked is the theory of panpsychism. Now, panpsychism is the idea that consciousness exists everywhere within all physical matter. So there are many different types of panpsychism, but one example is that consciousness is seen as another fundamental property of matter. So take an electron, for example, with its charge and its spin. It just sees consciousness as another of those essential properties. And essentially, as more atoms come together to produce ever increasingly complex forms, for example, from cells to snails to cats to humans, it is basically argued that that fundamental property of consciousness sort of comes together the more complex an organism is to produce a higher level of consciousness. So the key principle of panpsychism is that consciousness is everywhere, it's just a fundamental property of matter. So these are all obviously very differing viewpoints that have very differing implications about the nature of our reality, and it's very difficult to prove any one of them at this stage. But we do have science which hinges on this problem, and the science that I'm specifically going to talk about is how consciousness links to quantum physics, and I'm going to give you two very opposing views. Now, in order to understand these opposing views, we need to understand the double slit experiment, which I've drawn a little diagram of. Now, I've gone into this experiment in detail in a video I did about the science behind manifestation, so I won't be going into that level of detail here, but I will of course be explaining it enough that we can understand these interpretations, and one of the interpretations is one that I did not cover in that video. So the double slit experiment. Basically in this diagram we have two examples of what is going on in the double slit experiment. Essentially we have two walls, and one of the walls has two slits in. And what's happening in the double slit experiment is we are sending electrons, which are tiny little particles of matter. We're sending them through these two slits. So what you would imagine to happen when you send particles through two slits is that they're going to basically go through the slits in the direction of these slits. They're going to land on the back wall opposite to the two slits and kind of create two little clumps where they've landed on the back wall. So this is called a clump pattern, and it is what you would expect to happen when you send electrons through the two slits. But what actually happened is they actually got an interference pattern on the back wall. Now, this is what happens when waves go through two slits, because as you can see, they interfere with each other when they go through, causing this interference pattern. So what was confusing about this experiment is they're getting an interference pattern, which is characteristic of waves, when they were sending electrons through. So they should be getting a clump pattern, but they're getting an interference pattern. So what scientists did to try and work this out is they essentially set up a measuring device, which they placed before the two slits, to try and observe what was happening here. But the interesting thing is, when the measuring device was present, the particles actually started producing the clump pattern. So when the measuring device was present, the particles started acting like particles again. So the main interpretation of what's happening here is that somehow measurement or observation is collapsing the wave into a physical particle. So when the particle is acting like a wave, it's essentially in a superposition of states. So for example, the wave is going through two slits at the same time. It's in two positions at once. Now this superposition of states is what's called the wave function. The wave function describes these different values, these different positions of the particle when it's acting like a wave. So how does this link to the mind-body problem? Essentially, there are some other interpretations which concern how consciousness is linked to this whole process. And these two interpretations that I'm going to discuss are basically opposites of each other. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is subjective reduction. Now, subjective reduction is the idea that it is consciousness that is causing the wave function to collapse. Now, this interpretation is known as the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation, and it doesn't exactly specify what level of consciousness causes the wave function to collapse, but the essential idea is that it is consciousness. So the particle collapses from being in a superposition of states to adopting a discrete position as a particle as a result of consciousness or observation. Now, a completely opposing view to subjective reduction is the idea of objective reduction. Now, objective reduction is the idea that consciousness actually emerges from the collapse of the wave function. So it's basically like the complete other way round of subjective reduction. So where this idea of objective reduction comes from is a theory by Hammeroff and Penrose. So basically, within neurons, we have something called microtubules, and these are responsible for the maintenance of synapses. So Hammeroff and Penrose basically turned to these microtubules to create their theory. So within microtubules, we have something called tubulins, and these are basically protein subunits of microtubules, and they exist in at least two conformations, let's say A and B. So with the double slit experiment, we already talked about how the particle exists in a superposition of states prior to the collapse of the wave function. Similarly, Hammeroff and Penrose suggest that these tubulins, which exist in at least two conformations, basically exist in a superposition of states prior to the collapse of the wave function. Now, they correlate this to the stage of pre-conscious processing. Now, they suggest that through the collapse of the wave function, the tubulin adopts one of the two states, A or B, and they correlate this to conscious processing. So the post-collapse condition corresponds to the conscious stage. So essentially, Hammeroff and Penrose suggest that through this quantum process that is happening in the brain, consciousness emerges from the collapse of the wave function. Now, this theory has been criticised for many reasons, the main one being it doesn't really explain how consciousness is produced. Essentially, why would the collapse of tubulins into one discrete state produce consciousness? That question still remains a mystery within this theory. And of course, the idea of subjective reduction and the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation has also been the subject of many criticisms as well. One of the main criticisms of that interpretation is that it doesn't define what it means to be consciousness and what level of consciousness is needed to collapse the wave function. For example, is it only a human that can collapse the wave function, or could a cat collapse the wave function, or a worm? Or is there some form of cosmic consciousness which is actually collapsing the wave function? But it is unsurprising that we don't have an answer to that question, because consciousness itself is a complete mystery. And also, a lot of scientists actually just reject the idea of subjective reduction on philosophical grounds. They don't like that it implies dualism, the idea that matter and consciousness are two completely separate things. But it doesn't have to imply that, and also we can't rule dualism out because all of this is a complete mystery. Anyway, if either of these theories are correct, either subjective reduction or objective reduction, both of them would imply that consciousness is more than just an epiphenomenon of the brain. In the case of subjective reduction, it implies that consciousness has a causal role in the shaping of our reality. So when it comes to the mind-body problem and how the mind is linked to the body or physical reality in general, subjective reduction implies that there is a causal process happening there, going from mind to matter. In the case of objective reduction, it implies that consciousness is a result of quantum processes, as opposed to just an epiphenomenon of brain processes as a whole. So it may differ from typical materialistic theories in that sense, but when it comes to the mind-body problem, objective reduction still implies that consciousness is a result of physical processes. So these are two very different approaches which would give very different answers to the mind-body problem. Ultimately, it is still a complete mystery, and I just love investigating all of the ideas that surround it. And I hope you did too in this video. Thank you for watching.